Okay, hello all. Today I want to talk with you about Catherine's foreign policy. So we are talking about the reign of Catherine II, Catherine the Great, and today I want to focus in on her foreign policy. Actually, I'm going to focus in on just one part. The partitions of Poland is our main topic today. But just to give an overview, because I'll talk to you about foreign policy more than once, there's a lot going on in Catherine's reign. And we're going to pay attention to Europe. Our main story in Europe is the partitions of Poland. What happens with Prussia and Germany and Frederick II is also part of it, and that will kind of come to the fore today. In a different lecture, we're going to talk about the Southern strategy because it's on Catherine's watch that the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea is annexed. A territory called New Russia is claimed and created. Uh, this is a name that Putin has attempted to reinvigorate around southern Russia, and it has its roots in Catherine's reign. Excuse me. And then also, from our American perspective, um, it is during Catherine's reign that the American Revolution happens. And Catherine of Russia is quite proactive in Russia's capacity as an emerging world leader in emphasizing neutrality of the seas among international powers, which works to America's great advantage because Britain at the time, major maritime power, if they are policed and curtailed on the open seas at all, then they have more logistical difficulties in delivering their might to those upstart colonists. And so more probably out of a geopolitical sense of clipping rival Britain's wings more than wanting to necessarily help the cause of freedom in America. Catherine is a proponent of open sea neutrality, which ends up being a huge advantage to the revolutionary colonists that will become the United States of America. And um, so those are kind of big picture things about Catherine's reign that we'll talk about. But and I want to just pause, starting out on this question of who made Catherine's foreign policy. The views have been different, and one of the most famous historians of Russia, 19th century historian V.O. Kluchevsky, had this to say about Catherine's foreign policy. He said, "The absence of any clear and definite program of her own involuntarily forced Catherine to adopt Frederick the Great's dispassionate and soberly thought out plan." So there we see from this man a real assumption that Catherine has. Oh, and how could I get his Osipovich, his patronymic wrong? Excuse me. Um, Excuse me. Pardon me. Um, so we see this take from a very distinguished historian that Catherine didn't have too much to do with thinking and driving her own foreign policy. And that said, Gluchevsky didn't do all the work and all the documents that has since been done on Catherine. And we do find we want to take her. We always want to be skeptical about people's own words about themselves. We're all the heroes of our own story, and we are all uh, biased towards our own points of view, if not self-aggrandizing. That said, um, Catherine, er, fairly early on in her reign, or in one letter to Potemkin, who is probably closest to her true self. This is the lover that she secretly married, and said, "I want to do the governing myself and let Europe know this." As we know, Catherine was very concerned about what Europe thought of Russia, what thought of her, what Europe thought of her. She identified increasingly with them. And she's also in other writings picking up on work by Bakhrutin and Skazkin. They write that she also um, wrote that she wanted to be the arbiter of the destinies of Europe. And we certainly see that kind of behavior with the story we'll focus on today, the partitions of Poland. And she was also written as saying that time will show everybody that we are not dragging along in anyone else's wake, that Catherine was explicit among her advisors like Panin and others that they wanted to be a Russia that was going to call its own shots and identify its own interests. I mean, in some ways, I think an iteration of this is now, while many observers of analysts have recognized Russia has no friends. It just has its own interest that it thinks it identifies and pursues. So the point I think that the historical consensus is coming around, despite Kluchevsky's earlier 19th century dismissal of Catherine's kind of role in thinking about Russia's place strategically. She did take a role. She read all the papers. She insisted on having them from early in her reign, and foreign policy was a very, very important part of how what she devoted her energies to. So with that, let's talk about the partitions of Poland. In some ways, one of the most cynical diplomatic acts in history. In the late 18th century, Austria, Russia, and Poland got together and they disappeared Poland from the map. And this could, they interfered mightily in Poland's past, to make a great understatement. Um, And in some ways, we could look to this history and say, "Oh, look at that Russian interference in other countries' doings." And indeed, there's a history. There's a history, many histories there that have resonance into our own day and situation. But in a way, I want to come at it from a different angle. Um, Come at it from Poland, the internal story of what happened in Poland in the centuries leading up to its eradication from the map. Before doing that, I want to point out, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Poland has been one of the main countries in immediately and substantively stepping up to help Ukraine. There's no country which has taken in more Ukrainian refugees than Poland. Some statistics say that 28 million passages have gone through Poland across the Ukrainian border since February 2024. Many of them going out and going back in traffic. But so there's been a tremendous amount of traffic through Poland, and there's been a tremendous amount of refugees. At one point, I had read that maybe upwards of 4 million refugees were there, and now perhaps the number, here we are 4 years in, has settled into 1 million. But it's also been been reported by the Stockholm School of Economics that in the immediate months after the full-scale invasion, you had a situation in Poland where 70% of households in Poland were in some way doing something to offer material help to Ukrainian refugees, whether taking them into their own home, providing a job, providing food and clothes, or transport assistance, meeting people at the station. And so we really just saw this massive mobilization. And this, even this picture on the right is from, I was in Krakow, Poland in May 2024. And there still was constantly on the town square there, people with Ukrainian flags and demonstrations for support of Ukraine. And this is particularly telling because the history between Poland and Ukraine is not an entirely happy history. In the 20th century, we have some really dark moments. And yet, for all of that, the messiness that might be in that history, with the full-scale invasion by Russia in 2022, II, Poland immediately um, went from clarity to action instantly with respect to the threat that Russia posed. And Poland's history um, knows something about the threats of Russia. So uh, I feel like delving, you know, spending some time talking about the partitions can get us to, a deeper understanding of a really important player in early modern European history that disappeared and get a little bit more into the why of it disappeared because it says something about internal dysfunction. And speaking of dysfunction, in 1688, we the King of Poland said this. Future generations will wonder in astonishment that after such resounding victories, such international triumph and glory, we now face, alas, eternal shame and irreversible loss, for we now find ourselves without resources, helpless, and seemingly incapable of government. These words were spoken to the Senate, not the US Senate, not the US Senate in the 2020s, but to the Polish Senate in 1688 by King Jan III Sobieski. And so, um, and this, he's saying this a century before Austria, Prussia, and Russia conspired to eliminate Poland from the map. In 1772, under the pretense of defending the Polish Constitution, which in actuality meant preventing reforms, Austria, Prussia, and Russia annexed chunks of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to themselves, reducing the territory and population by about one-third. In 1792, these same powers again mobilized, further dismembering Poland. And when some patriotic Poles rose in rebellion against this dismemberment, the partitioning powers finished the job in 1795, distributing what remained of Poland amongst themselves. Poland would disappear from the map of Europe until it was restored only in the wake of World War I. It was one of the most cynical events in the history of Europe, and it was done in the name of protecting traditional Polish freedoms known as the Golden Freedoms. Among those golden freedoms was the liberum veto, which is Latin for, I freely forbid this. And it was, and so as I said, this is in some ways, we could tell this as a story of foreign interference because the very last deputy of the Polish parliament, which was called the Sejm, S-E-J-M, pronounced Sejm, the Sejm, the very last deputy in the Sejm to shut down the Polish Sejm in this practice of obstruction that had been gaining momentum. That happened in 1767, and he was in the pay of the Russian Empire. So Catherine, as I shared with you, had herself written that she wanted to be the arbiter of destinies of Europe, and she was doing just that. But instead, I want to focus on something different. Poland's demise was the result of internal decay. This cynical agreement between Austria, Prussia, and Russia happened because Poland, which had been the largest land power in Europe in the 16th century, which had had a glorious court and produced many bright figures, had become dysfunctional. In 1717, jumping a little bit ahead, Russian troops provided over a meeting of what was notoriously called the Silent Sejm. And it was so named because Russian troops intimidatingly were outside the building and prepared to enforce a new rule that had been called that no one could speak, in which was, by tradition, a very vibrant discourse. No one could speak as they proceeded to bring an end to what had been a civil war underway. And then again, in 1768, on the grounds of protecting religious freedom, Russia went so far to make enfeebled Poland a protectorate. Now, such an enlarged and empowered Russia was too much for Austria and Prussia to stomach. And so these continental powers got in on the action. They came together. It was Austria that actually first proposed um, the initial dismemberment. But they were able to do that because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been sliding into dysfunction for decades. There is no single moment, in my view, and even the partitions that removed Poland from the map came themselves in three discrete stages over 2 decades, 1770, 1772, 1772, 1793, 1795. What had happened in Poland was that gradually the norms, the values, and the capacities that it had enjoyed were eroded until it was it was a polity that had been a mighty power but could not organize itself to reverse its dysfunction nor mount a resistance to stop its own demise. It was a tragic descent from what had been a glorious state. So I want to hear backtrack a little bit. What was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? So here is pretty much a map of it, and you had Kingdom Poland, which this Moldavia ended up being part of it too. You had Kingdom Poland, and then here you had the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Here's a different map that shows in different colors. Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Ruthenia, Kingdom of Poland. They came together in one big step, in one big entity. Muscovy is over here. This in this southern parts that Catherine, much of which Catherine is taking, but not always. All you have nomads that still are very much prevail across the steppe. But then to the south in the Black Sea, you have the Ottoman Empire in purple here. Um, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had started to take shape in the 13th century. And it's an interesting place because it had, in the 13th century, it had its first Catholic king. And then in the 14th century, it had a return to an apostasy when someone kind of moves back from a religion to which they've converted to. You had Gediminas, who promised to convert to Latin Christianity, but reneged and retained his paganism. In some ways, it might have been strategy because he was presiding over territory in which there were both Orthodox and Catholic nobles. And so, in some ways, he skirted what could have been an alienating choice by doing that. So, at any rate, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that is into the big um, land, big state into which Kiev was. And it's only with the Union of Lublin that Kiev falls into the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of um, it'd been part of Lithuania. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What is it? It formally begins in 1569, although the, because of dynastic marriages where the Lithuanian Jagiellonian marriages were made between Lithuania and the Poles, so they have a dynastic union from 1380 and the what's called the Union of Krevo, 1385, the Union of Krevo was a marriage agreement between Jogala and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Yaduga or Jogala, and that makes the Jagiellonian dynasty. In 1413, the Union of Heraldo was an agreement whereby Polish noble privileges were extended to uh, Lithuanian nobles. In 1569, the Union of Lublin is formed. And the Union of Lublin is formed as a defensive measure against Muscovy. In 1558, just a little while before, Tsar Ivan IV had launched the Livonian War in an attempt to gain a foothold on the Baltic. He didn't succeed in that. But so Muscovy was an aggressor, and Lithuania and Poland both recognized it, and so they came together. Now, the coming together wasn't an entirely even keel arrangement, and the here's a 19th century picture kind of capturing that ambiguity. And this is of Nikolai Radziwiłł the Red, who was a defender of Lithuanian sovereignty on his knees. And on his knees in the sense that we recognize a bad situation, but we also regard that we're giving something up by joining this union, that we are somehow the less equal partner. And this could be taken in both ways at some level, but it is but in 1573, so just a few years after after the Union of Lublin, we have the Warsaw Confederation Act, and the Warsaw Confederation Acts, but is the law by which the Sejm grants religious freedoms to nobility and free persons in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so this is a remarkable moment. If this 1413 Union of Heraldo, Polish nobles had extended noble privileges to the Catholic nobles, excluding the Orthodox ones. This rectifies that now Orthodox nobles will be recognized as Orthodox nobles. And I want to point out what an extraordinary act this is in 1573, because in 1572, there had been the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on the streets of France, where thousands of Catholic soldiers are killing Protestants in a massacre that results from conflict at a royal wedding. All right. And this was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was one of the most horrific single days in a century of really horrific days, all that we might put under the guise of the wars of religion as Protestantism emerged, rent the church asunder, and it had all kinds of wars and conflicts that followed therefrom, because we're living in a world where it wasn't separation of church and state. If anything, the framers of the United States Constitution had studied the 16th century in Europe, the wars of religion, and appreciated how much religion could divide a society. And it's why one of the foundational commitments of the United States of America is separation of church and state, freedom of conscience. The state shall make no law respecting religion. That foundational principle, in many ways, emerged from studying the carnage of the wars of religion in 16th century Europe. But even as Europe is tearing itself apart, you have a remarkably pluralistic state. You had Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox and Jews that are all landowners and have political rights in the same. So it's really a remarkable story. It's really a remarkable story that I won't dig deep into. But so that's how we have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of course, I don't want to paint things too rosy. In 1589, Moscow is raised to the status of the Patriarchate, which means now Orthodox um, priests and higher-ranking clerics will look, maybe perhaps instead of to Constantinople or within Lithuania, they'll look to Moscow for leadership. And this is very disconcerting for Polish leadership that sees a need to have a kind of defensive strategy against Muscovy. And so in 1596, we have the Union of Brest, which kind of takes politicking to theology, where basically they create the Uniate Church, which is essentially orthodox orthodoxy in practice, with the one change that they look to the Pope. Excuse me, my voice has been challenging me in the last week. So they look to the Pope. Um, it- so religious tensions exist, and as I mentioned in a previous lecture, this move probably backfires quite significantly since of many Orthodox don't understand and are bothered by this turn to the Latin Church. Certainly, the Cossacks that had been perhaps a more diverse group, the move seems to have solidified allegiance to Orthodoxy in their ranks. You have King Sigismund the Third Vasa in the early 17th century, who's less tolerant. He's very much Jesuit influenced, and you have kind of real strident strains of Catholic Jesuits at this moment, and so he tends to be less tolerant towards the Orthodox. But he passes in 1632 and is replaced by King Vladislav the fourth, who makes a real effort to restore tolerance. In November of 1632, he signed the Measures for Accommodation of Citizens of the Kingdom of Poland, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Nation of Ruthenia, and Greek faith. And so, and thus, Poland marches on. Now, I want to talk about the kind of the political and the constitutional order of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Long before absolutism is even a twinkle in the eye of the likes of the Tudor dynasty or other countries that will kind of uh, evolve to absolute rule in early modern Europe, the Polish kingdom had from the late 14th century established a system of elected kingship. They developed a robust constitutional system, not a written constitution. They actually, Poles trying to reckon with the crisis that has been emerging in the late 18th century. In 1791, will finally, amongst themselves, um, ratify a first written constitution, but it is never enacted because, spoiler, it's too little too late. And at that point, other foreign entities are either been sweeping in and eliminating their political sovereignty and autonomy. So they do write the first written constitution in Europe in 1791, but it doesn't ever actually get enacted. But we still say they had a constitutional order. They had rules according to which the system ruled. The United States, we have a written constitution. We take great pride in it. The US, for better or for worse, no, we take great pride in it. England, a centuries long standing parliamentary system, has no written constitution, but they still have a constitutional order. Poland had a constitutional order, and it involved elected kingship. And the idea was having a weak king and a strong nobility, which has upsides and downsides. Um, how was the king elected? The king was elected by the Sejm, which is kind of the word for a Polish parliament. It's bicameral, but the key thing is that the szlachta was the word for Polish nobility, and the Polish nobility was actually a quite substantial nobility. It was quite large. About 10% of the population was the Polish nobility. Um, and that's a loose sense, calling the szlachta the Polish nobility because they weren't all, don't think super duper rich nobility, certainly in its early iterations. So they elected the king. The szlachta comprised over 10% of the population. So if that level of enfranchisement is underwhelming to us now, know that it was a greater proportion of the population than voted in France or England, even around the 1830s, in the 19th century. And it was a far greater population than partook in the selection of the American president in 1800. So we've got a large degree of enfranchisement of people that actually have political rights. The system was founded on an ethos of freedom, pluralism, checks on monarchical power, and, and excuse, the elected king was obligated to convene the Sejm, and it was the Sejm's power to finance war and to levy other taxes. Now, the Schlata also had this right of confederation in the event of crisis or profound disagreement with the king. And that confederation, you could have kind of form an alliance, a faction of people that agree with you over something and make legal orders, including armed uprising. And that was the right of, excuse me, that was the right of confederation. It didn't need to happen. I mean, it didn't need to be armed. On some occasions, it was. But in some ways, this is what contributed to the idea that others in, 17th century Europe would talk about Polish anarchy, that the nobles were so enfranchised and they had so much power. The um, so they had the right of confederation. They had from 1505, and this starts in Poland, and they bring it into the Union of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this concept of nihil novi. And that is that the king will declare kind of nothing new, nihil novi, nothing new without the same, um, more or less. So again, we have a very empowered electorate at some level. And there's also this tradition of the liberum veto. And that the liberum veto was the right of one minority voice to veto the decisions of the Sejm. This last freedom existed for well over a century before it was ever invoked. Restraint governed custom. But that would change in the 17th century. So then, so in addition, we have all these plurals, and I've said a little bit about religion, and I want to tell you this one more bit. In addition to these political traditions, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth practiced a level of religious tolerance unique in Reformation Europe. In Gdansk, that's in northern Poland, for example, some churches held both Lutheran and Catholic churches in the same building. So while other people are killing each other over whether they're Protestant or Catholic, in Poland, you have one service in the morning and then the other service in the same building in the afternoon. In the 1550s, there is an incident where a bishop of Poznan sentenced a cobbler to death for heresy, and over 100 armed Schlata of various denominations, so Protestants and Catholics in the mix, they laid siege to the episcopal palace, so it could be messy, to free the man. And as one Pole explained, it is not a question of religion, it is a question of liberty. So this is 16th century Poland. And in 1562, following, the Sejm annulled that church tribunal's jurisdiction, saying that's how you're going to operate. You don't have any power on our territory. And in 1572, as I mentioned, as the king's troops are massacring Protestant subjects in the streets of Paris, you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth enacting the the Warsaw Confederation Act, guaranteeing religious freedom in the Schlata. So this multi-confessional pluralism shouldn't be overstated. With the 1595 Union of Brest, which subordinated Orthodox subjects to the Pope in reign, Orthodoxy became disfavored, even illegal, some would say. And it was that way until 1632 with Vladislav IV, as I mentioned. The creation of the Uniate Church had been intended to avoid the pull of loyalty to Moscow. it backfired epically, in my view, stoking religious rebellion of Ukrainian Cossacks in defense of Orthodoxy. So it wasn't a perfect picture, but nonetheless, as religious strife bloodied the lands to the west, Poland was a multi-confessional, multicultural exception, a land where even Jews could be ennobled. But gradually, that cherished ethos and that spirit gave way to obstruction. So, diversity is not easily achieved. It requires leadership, and the Jesuit-induced strident Catholicism of King Sigismund III Vasa definitely helped chip away at that. Economics also played a role. The This is, oh, here's a picture of kind of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and just showing you where it is in Europe if we didn't know already. But so economics also played a role in this, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But let me come back to kind of how did we see when we look back now, what were signs of dysfunction on the horizon? Well, as I said, the Liberum Veto was first invoked in 1652. It'd been around for over a century. And in the way historians tell this is that in previous times, someone would threaten the Liberum Veto, perhaps, and then they'd say, okay, I understand this is really important to you. Let's come back and talk about it. Let's get a resolution that you can feel you don't have to love, but that you can feel good enough to sign on to, right? That's what politics, in its best manifestation is going to be. Not everyone gets exactly what they want, but with compromise and discourse, persuasion and compromise, a resolution is reached that everyone can live with, and hopefully is through that process for the greater good. But in 1652, this guy just said liberum veto, and he's out the door. And so there's no possibility to talk. And everything they're working on, legislation they're about to, produce is scuttled. And a decade and a half go by before it happens again. So 1667 is the next time it happened. But then only a decade goes by. It happens in 1677. And then, though, across the turn of the 17th to 18th century, the use of the liberum veto becomes endemic to political life. During the reign of King Augustus II, he called 18 sessions of the same, and 10 of them ended by the liberum veto. Now, they found that initially you have these really wealthy magnates, Polish magnates, that are calling on lower paid magnates, like less enfranchised, to invoke the liberum veto. As if there was, they wouldn't necessarily do it themselves, but they kind of got someone in their pay who was willing to be that norm buster, custom breaker, and they were getting enough of it that they were willing to, take whatever blowback, they might have faced for invoking the liberum veto. So the big magnates aren't doing it themselves, but historians have found that they're really the ones behind it. And so here we need to tell an economic story. So that economics has something to do with played a role in the Polish-Lithuanians' demise. Poland served as the breadbasket of Europe for the growing cities of Western Europe as early modern capitalism is emerging. And what this means is people are having other jobs, making money in other ways than growing their food. They're becoming concentrated in an urban settings, so they need to buy. So more food needs to be grown and transported to these urban centers than the way the world previously worked, where the vast majority of people are making the food that they eat. Poland is the breadbasket for this. And so we see we even call it the second serfdom. It's not a legal serfdom. Russia has legalized serfdom. But effectively in Poland, we start to see these huge estates, and we see the emergence of a second serfdom, increasing wealth inequality. And and this is what opened the door to minor Schlata being bought by the real oligarchs. So according to the historian Adam Zamoyski, author of this book, The Polish Way, he took the liberum veto was deployed mostly by minor Schlata who were in the pocket of the big 18th century oligarchs, who people like it, if we were to make an analogy in America, the Koch brothers or the Mark Andreessens and Peter Thiels and Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos and some Silicon Valley tech bros, as we say, who people who saw themselves as kingmakers and king breakers. And there'd always been a significant socioeconomic spread among the Schlata. I mean, it's a really big group, but a giant point of pride for many in that membership was the ethos of equality. But the economic inequality that's growing and growing led to what we would say now was untenable friction. And yet, this untenable friction. And here, let me show a small sample. This we don't have great numbers on all this economic history, but Zamoyski does a deep dive on the Palatinate, which is just another kind of word for like bit of territory, whether county or district, whatever, of Lublin. Here it is on the map in the whole grand scheme of things. And he found that so in the 1550s, you had more than half of the Schlata had estates that were less than 1,500 land hectares, but they have land, so kind of mediish, and only 16 medium-ish. Only 16% here we have bigger estates that are over 7,500 hectares. 2 centuries later, only 10% of the Schlata have what we might call these small to medium holdings. More than 50% have these really, really big holdings. There's even about 12 families, just 12 families, that have massive holdings of land. And well, we don't have a comparative number here. Historians tell us this number has increased significantly, that you have about 120,000 people that have no land at all, right? So what we're seeing is increasing disparity, increasing economic disparity to the extent that here in this map, you see the red and blue and bright pink and brown. These are holdings of really big families, which in retrospect, it doesn't seem so massive, but these families start to have their own private armies that, in some cases, are even larger than the army of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Why? Well, because without legislation from the Schlata, the king can't raise taxes, can't fund an army. And if you have an increasingly dysfunctional Schlata that doesn't authorize the tax increases to fund the army, you have an enfeebled, it's too early to say the national army, but an enfeebled army of the country. And then simultaneously along this side, you have these Polish magnates that are wealthier than the king. The Radzivills, the Ostrowskos, the Siniavskis. And that is the situation that obtains. I mean, and you think a little bit now in America, it's become abundantly clear that in the last half century, income inequality has increased tremendously. And this has all kinds of knockoff effects, not just for what people can buy. Inequality Media finds that now the top 1% of America hold 40% of the wealth. I mean, one picture that really represented this for so many Americans was that the inauguration, some things back to when elected presidents just walked down Pennsylvania Avenue themselves on the day outside. I mean, that hasn't happened in a long time, but they even held it inside because the inauguree was worried about his hair getting messed up in bad weather or something, but in a really closed space. And the people that were there were the wealthiest people in the United States of America. And for many observers, they recognized something, a kind of court like a court-like presence of monarchies of old as opposed to the democratic republican functioning of the United States of America as it's historically been. And it turns out there's all sorts of knockoff effects. This right here has a share of the income going to the top 10% of the country correlated with union membership. And so we find that if in the 1950s we had a lower number, as the income inequality, the rich getting richer, has increased and getting richer to really in tremendous degrees, the amount of union membership, and unions are, organizations where people aggregate their power into to have better labor, better working conditions, whether working conditions or better pay or better benefits, really kind of like the collective power of labor. And so this is, these trends are going in very opposite directions as wealth inequality is reaching levels that exceeds even those levels that economists tell us existed in what we call as the robber baron days of the late 19th, early 20th century amidst early industrialization. So Robert Reich, a former labor secretary and economist at the University of California, Berkeley, who is in charge of inequality media, reports that the richest 100 billionaires in the US have a net worth of $3.86 trillion, and the entire bottom half of Americans have a wealth of $4 trillion. That's still a lot of money, but this is in definitional terms oligarchy. And there's other, for me, kind of from a Russian perspective, the perspective of someone paying attention to Russia, I also remember being very struck in 2023. And so this is during the Biden administration in 2023, reporting in which it talked about an Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon, Colin Kahl, called up Elon Musk's team to just confer and clear meetings and appointments that he was making in his job doing US foreign policy. Although Elon Musk was not an elected official, was not employed by the government, had no formal role, but he had his private businesses and the public-private partnerships had become so consequential to the United States of America. His Starlink network, which was very crucial for assisting Ukraine in thwarting Russia in its early years of the defense, which Elon voluntarily provided and then wanted to have some payment for it, and so that's where some of that dust up happened. But the point is that whatever one defines as national interest was so dependent upon not just private interest, but one single private interest, that you have the State Department clearing meetings with a private actor was a moment of pause for someone wondering how, what's the institutional structure of how our government works. And so it seems like some of the things that befell Poland, we can observe some of those dynamics here, just like you had, private individuals that had armies bigger than the state in late Poland and could scuttle any legislative agenda. You have you had oligarchs with that sort of power. You think about Peter Thiel has essentially picked the vice president of the United States or for the Republican ticket. So if we see some resonances that obtained in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and in the United States of America, we might just be reminded of Aristotle, the ancient Greek thinker who wrote this very important text in the Politics. And he writes basically, this is a bad thing. There's lots of ways to have government, but he says, and I just want to read you this excerpt from Aristotle's Politics. He says, it is manifest that the best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class, and that those states are likely to be well administered in which the middle class is large, and if possible, larger than both the other classes, or at any rate than either singly. For the addition of the middle class turns the scale and prevents either of the extremes from being dominant. Great then is the good fortune of a state in which the citizens have a moderate and sufficient property. For where some possess much and the rest nothing, there may arise an extreme democracy or a pure oligarchy, or a tyranny may grow out of either extreme, out of either the most rampant democracy or out of an oligarchy. But it is not so likely to arise out of the middle and nearly equal condition. Democracies are safer and more permanent than oligarchies because they have a middle class which is more numerous and has a greater share in the government. For when there is no middle class and the poor greatly exceed in number, troubles arise and the state soon comes to the end. So, one need not, this is Aristotle writing thousands, almost 2,000 years, just shy of 2,000 years before the likes of Karl Marx penned his Das Kapital. And one need not buy in to Karl Marx's vision of historical change requiring revolution, or Karl Marx's notions of consciousness in his schema of how the world works, to recognize that extreme wealth inequality is not good for a society, as Aristotle recognized thousands of years ago. And so, in Poland's case, um, this is what happened. Oligarchs began to scuttle political process, but soon enough, outside actors like Brandenburg and Prussia and Russia and Austria and France all recognized that they too could play a role in Poland's politics, and they became committed to making sure they liked this ability to play a role, and they became committed to it. For example, for over a century before the first partition of Poland, Russia and Prussia agreed that in every agreement they make, they mutually committed to defending Polish freedoms. How's that for euphemistic speech? Because defending Polish freedoms to them meant making sure that nothing eliminated the liberum veto, which was such a valuable tool in order to scuttle functioning of the same and of the political order in Poland. And so, but it's all but lovely language that we are committed to defending Polish freedoms. And so basically you have in 1715 a civil war that emerges out of the Confederation of Tarnograd, and then because King Augustus II was actually a German. So one of this weak king, strong nobility formulas, one of the things it led to was that often you have the nobility, they wanted to import a king that was going to be weaker, kind of in the way that, Russian imperial marriages in the 18th century, there's a real attention to potential influence on our own affairs. And so many in the Polish they wanted an outside king, and they often had outside kings. But Augustus II was a Saxon, and he brought in his Saxon soldiers when he couldn't get the same to do what he wanted. And this boiled up into civil war, and Russia steps in and mediates with 30,000 soldiers. That comes in 1717 to a special session of the Sejm to resolve the crisis in which no one can speak. and Russian soldiers were there to enforce just in case. And so we have what goes down in history as the Silent Same. And so now we have, Russia has figured out how to play a role. There's another war of succession in 33 when King Augustus the second died. The Schlata gets together and they elect a French favored king, but Russia and Austria don't like that. And they insist on having another Schlata and forced elections that will elect King Augustus III in 1733. So we're starting to see how this internal dysfunction, now foreign powers have studied it sufficiently to recognize it and instrumentalize it. And thus things proceed until Stanislav Poniatowski, he's making another appearance for us because he was Catherine's second lover in St. Petersburg when he, as a young Polish nobleman from a really important family, or he married an even wealthier bride that brought more resources to his family. He had attached himself to the English party at diplomatic party in St. Petersburg, and in that context, he had become Catherine's lover, and then he was sent away. Well, he gets chosen to be King of Poland in 1764, and that was a just fine choice for Catherine because she felt like they had left things well enough that she could have him as something of a puppet. So when I joked before that she was like, "We're done and your country's gone," that's not exactly how it happened. Although he'll end up without a country. Stanislav Poniatowski is the last king of Poland, and he presides. He wanted to make reforms. It's probably not fair to call him a puppet of Catherine entirely. He wanted to make reforms, but at some level, it's too little, too late. And we start to see the partitions of Poland. Now, in 1768, you have another Confederation of Bar. Bar is a town in Poland, and it is formed because you have Poles that are committed to reforming in ways that can strengthen the kingship and strengthen the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a total, as a political entity. So it won't be at the a wet rag at the rims of rich magnates or outside powers. But this leads to a civil war. And this civil war is the pretense for which Russia intervenes with troops on the ground. And Catherine, again, very nice words. She insists that she is doing this in the spirit of religious toleration. She's concerned that the Orthodox, those of the Orthodox faith, that their religious rights are going to be undermined. And so she needs to move in and declares that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth becomes a protectorate. Well, when this happens, so this move, if Austria and Prussia are watching and looking at the map of Europe, and if Russia were to just take possession and annex all of Poland, then their geopolitical fortunes are much diminished, and they don't want to see that happen. And so they move in, and it's actually Austria that proposes the first partition. And so they do, that's what they do. Austria gets 2.7 million Polish subjects, Prussia gets some of northern Poland, and Russia gets 1.8 million subjects, mostly from eastern Belarusia and southeast Latvia. This will, here's a map of our first partition. So this goes to, here's Prussia, here's Russia, here is Crown Poland, and here is England. And so these black bits, or this black outline shows this goes to Russia. Prussia gets some up here, and this goes to Austria. This land that goes to Russia, by the way, will become the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement, which only gets formally established in 1791 before the second partition, but basically with that first partition, Russia for the first time has a really substantial portion of its population that's Jewish. Why are there so many Jews in this part of the world? There's so many Jews in this part of the world because through much, beginning in medieval Western Europe, Jews had been forbidden to own land as anti-Semitism is emerging in the Middle Ages, like a real shift from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. You can be a Catholic, but if you're a Jew, we still harbor resentment, anti-Semitism against you. And so Jews were basically kept out of, forced out of medieval England, with the exception of the court of Portugal in the 15th century that recognized that people that hadn't had been able to own their own land and farm it had been pushed into urban centers, often are acquiring numeracy. They can write, they can do math and keep records, which are all really useful skills for if you want to develop the science of cartography and geography and knowledge building and a whole bunch of other things. But with the exception of Poland, Jews are forced out, and many of them moved eastward into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where they could be. And many of them, bringing their numeracy, ended up in this role of bailiff. So there were many Jewish peasants, but often because they did maybe bring a degree of numeracy and literacy, they end up in the role of managers on big estates where the landlords are far away, living in the lap of luxury, and these bailiffs that are overseeing the peasants during this phase of the second serfdom are often bearing the brunt of resentment from the peasants. So this also contributes to anti-Semitism. And we see in the mid 17th century in Ukrainian lands, the uprising led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack, who is very famous as being kind of a father of the Ukrainian nation, who led uprisings against Poland in his pursuit of Cossack sovereignty and autonomy. Well, his uprisings became very intermingled with Jewish pogroms, where Jews were chased out, injured, murdered by the crowds that were getting behind Khmelnytsky. So this is all part of this very messy history. So that was the first partition. Here we have a print from a German library of Catherine. Here's Catherine sitting here and her advisors, and there they are looking at a map of Europe, just contemplating what will we do with Poland, how we solve the Polish problem. And I'll wrap up. And so there's much recognition that, the Polish system became dysfunctional. We need to amend it. There's this attempt by the Sejm to enact a constitution. They agree on it, to ratify it, but when they do not get to enact it because Austria, Prussia, and Russia will act in concert again in 1793 and then 1795 again to eliminate Poland. Now I want to turn. You've been just reading about Nadezhda Durova, a woman who presents as a man throughout adulthood and fights in the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe not the only case of that. Count Casimir Pulaski was a Pole who participated in the Confederation of the Bar, and then he has to flee Poland, and he ends up making his way. And Poniatowski even told him, King Poniatowski said, you'd be best to get out of Dodge at this point, and he does. He ends up making his way to the United States or to the colonies where he ends up, he ends up being in France for a little bit, but he gets to the US as the Revolutionary War is getting underway, and he enlists in the army. He participates at the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, where he saved George Washington's life, and then Washington makes him a brigadier general. And then in 1779, so the war is still underway, he is mortally wounded and at the siege of Savannah and dies some days later. It turns out that Pulaski may have been a female. And the Smithsonian Magazine and some scholars at Arizona State University did work on this. There had been some rumors. There was some controversy about where his body was even buried because he was wounded in battle. He was brought onto a ship, and then was he given a burial at sea or was he actually buried? So there was question about where Pulaski's body was. But the folks at Arizona State, in collaboration with others, did DNA testing. Pulaski had no children, but he had a niece, and from descendants, did DNA testing and felt that they reasonably confirmed that this was indeed Pulaski's body. It remains somewhat contested, but on the skeleton, they found um, they found bits that corresponded to Pulaski's life. He had broken one hand at one point, and the same fingers, you could tell that they had been fractured. And he also seems to have had a mark, although this portrait doesn't quite say it, on the face. That might have been some sort of benign tumor or something, and that it left a mark in one of the skulls. So people have felt with a fairly high degree of confidence that this is Pulaski's skeleton. And what else they found out about that skeleton is that by the pelvis and all the other measures that people that study bones recognize, this was a female skeleton. Without soft tissue, they can't say more about the organs. And so many questions remain. But this, and one of the questions is, was this an intersex individual? We don't know the answers to that, but it's really remarkable, a remarkable bit of information. And then another one, Tadeusz Kozusko, if I'm mispronouncing his name, he actually serves in the American Army, then comes back and he participates in an uprising in 1794 in an attempt to defend Polish freedom as he'd been defending American freedom, was ultimately, unfortunately, unsuccessful. But so here's two instances of these Polish nobles, Kosciuszko and Pulaski, who served in the American Revolution, fighting for the idea of freedom. And this right here is Kosciuszko was also an architect, and he helped design and build the fortifications at West Point. This is a remnant of, I think, Fort Clinton. Even to this day, there's a plaque honoring him. So here, I don't want to keep you too much more. Here's just a map of the third partitions of Poland, in which Poland disappears from the map. And I want to, and so just to look really schematically, what happens after the partitions? Well, you have many Poles that, and this long political tradition, so they didn't go lightly. And the Duchy of Warsaw is formed in 1807. It's created by Napoleon Bonaparte. And they don't have much in the way of political rights, but Napoleon makes big promises to Poles, and it's why he had enthusiastic enlistment from Poles in the Napoleonic armies because they wanted their country back. It was augmented in 1809 by, I think that this is a Treaty of Tilsit. The Duchy of Warsaw, however, in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, Russian troops occupy that territory as they defeated Napoleon. And in the 1815 European Congress of Vienna, it eliminated the Duchy of Warsaw, and that territory is divided between Prussia and Russia. Under Tsar Alexander I, who kind of fancies himself, certainly early in his reign, as a reformer, Poland, Congress Poland is created and is granted a kind of functioning constitution. It has its own army. It has some limited autonomy within the Russian Empire. Truly, Congress Poland had more political rights in 1819 than did your average Russian subject. Congress Poland existed from 1815 to 1864. Even if they had a slightly better deal than Central Russia, Central Russians, they still had a history, tradition, memory, and aspirations to be politically independent and sovereign. And so that wasn't good enough for so many of them. There were insurrections in 1830 and 31. They eliminated the Constitution and the army, and then additional revolts in 1863 or so under Nicholas, a reactionary czar, and Congress Poland was eliminated entirely. And Poland wouldn't reemerge again as a country until after World War I. In the wake of World War I, a sovereign independent Poland was again established. Um, and then, as many of you know, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and just weeks after, Stalin invaded Poland. Um, September 17th, 1939, Stalin and Hitler had made a special pact to divvy up Poland, as a matter of fact. And even though Stalin was an ally fighting Hitler, from August to 2000, there were Poles that, again, fighting for Polish independence and with the Allies, and they staged the Warsaw Uprising. When Stalin learned of this, he waited. He had Soviet troops halt and not proceed on Warsaw, although they could have, um, because he intentionally wanted to let the Nazis massacre Poles that he understood would be adamant for their own liberty and sovereignty. And then Poland as a country was finally liberated from January to May 1945 for its efforts in World War II. It ended up behind the Iron Curtain and was essentially a satellite of the Soviet Union until the Solidarity Movement in 1989. While the Soviet Union still exists in the midst of glasnost, it kind of reemerges as with a functional democratic-ish politics. And so I wanted to kind of go through all that to help understand, how a country, two countries, Poland and Ukraine, between whom there have been frictions in the past, why have we seen such an outpouring of Polish support for Ukraine in the wake of Russia's invasion? And I think that history has something to do with it. And I think as well, I mean, I won't go on too long as well, but I think there's actually lessons in the story of Poland's dysfunction that any country striving to be a functioning democracy, democratic republic, how you want to name it, might pay attention to. If the liberum veto, we can look back now and say, its abuse was something of a canary in the coal mine. It seems like the United States of America has a number of canaries in the coal mine that it might look to as well. Signs of creeping dysfunction. One might look to the use of the filibuster, for example, the creeping use of executive orders to when you have a Congress that won't act. We've seen slippage in this. It is the Congress that has the power to declare war, and only the Congress. And yet the United States has just been engaged in a war of choice against Iran for over a month with no declaration of war from the Congress. But this war costs taxpayers $1 billion every single day. And so there's all kinds of signs, whether be it in gerrymandering, the ossification of representation, the impossibility of amending the Constitution, as Jill Lepore has so eloquently written about in a book, We the People, A History of the United States Constitution. The United States has, and whether it's the degradation of the use of words, for example, fake is a word that has a meaning in the dictionary, but out of the mouth of the President of the United States, it is used to refer to true things that reflect badly on the President of the United States. So that abrogation of fidelity to the meaning of words we might put in that just that category of less concrete acts that we might count, but maybe the types of norms and ethos that also can have significant consequences for a society. All right, and there we'll stop. We'll talk about Catherine's Southern strategy next time.